Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled, Emerging Issues for Pharma R&D, a Practical Approach for Pediatric Drug Programs. My name is Vicky, and I will be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, with time for a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. And at this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. And at this point, I would like to thank Certara, who helped develop the content for this presentation. Certara is a leading decision support technology and consulting organization committed to optimizing drug development and improving health outcomes. Certara's solutions, which span drug discovery through patient care, use the most scientifically advanced modeling and simulation technologies and regulatory strategies to increase the probability of regulatory and commercial success. Its clients include hundreds of global biopharmaceutical companies, leading academic institutions, and key regulatory agencies. And now I would like to hand the presentation over to Suzanne Minton, Manager of Scientific Communications at Certara.
Thanks, Vicki. Hello, everyone. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. J.F. Marier. Dr. Marier has directed pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic analyses, reporting, and modeling and simulation projects for hundreds of studies in early and late clinical research. His drug development expertise spans non-clinical and population PK/PD modeling and simulation across all phases of development and in specific populations, including pediatrics, geriatrics, renal and hepatic impaired. JF's expertise includes scientific and regulatory consultation on drug development programs for large and small molecules, particularly in the therapeutic areas of oncology, inflammation, immunosuppressants, cardiovascular, infectious disease, and metabolic diseases. JF has authored or co-authored more than 100 abstracts and manuscripts and book chapters in the field of PK/PD and has leveraged modeling and simulation to build and optimize drug development programs for dozens of industry sponsors. JF earned his PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Montreal, Faculty of Pharmacy, and is a fellow of the American College of Clinical Pharmacy. JF, welcome to the webinar. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Suzanne. We're honored to have Dr. Mangum as a speaker today. Barry and Certara have collaborated together on a few projects in the past several years, and we've always been quite impressed by the passion and level of professionalism at Pedion Research. Barry has a very impressive bio with a very high success rate for the implementation of clinical trials in pediatric patients. He also has extensive academic experience serving as a faculty and researcher at Duke and UNC's medical schools, as well as CRO experience working as a senior director of pediatric clinical development at Quintiles. The regulatory landscape of pediatric drug development has changed a lot over the last couple of years, not just at FDA, but also in Europe. Barry will provide an overview of challenges and opportunities in pediatric drug development, and I'm sure everyone will appreciate. Barry, to you.
Thank you, JF, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and present to you today. I'm going to go back up. There we go. And I wanted to kind of give you guys a little bit of a background of who we are, and this will be the only time that I'll do this. Our company is Pedion Research. We started this company about three and a half, 4 years ago as an outgrowth of what we had envisioned 20 years ago was going to happen in pediatrics. And some of that I'll share with you today. But the name Pedion is a Greek word which means little child, and that's exactly what we do. We perform clinical trials, everything from pre-IND work all the way through submission for your pediatric programs. in the United States and also in the European space. So with that, I'll go right into the presentation. My area of expertise and work over the last 35 years has been in neonatal medicine. And as you can see from this child that you have in front of you, this is 750-gram, 28-week gestation baby who has many, many complications ahead of them. But this patient population offers us a unique opportunity to study and learn about the developing biology in this patient population. So as we begin today's discussion, we're going to center it from what I would call the worst case scenario, which is a neonatal patient that may be 23-week gestation baby, 24, 25, 26, 27. And I'll tell you that there are a number of companies that are out on the domain who are actually developing specific drugs for targets in this patient population. This child that you have here in front of you is going to end up having potentially bronchopulmonary dysplasia. This child is in the surfactant space where we do surfactant replacement. And this child has a number of issues that will evolve over time, whether it's infectious disease issues, whether it's intracranial bleed, or whether it's some other GI distress, such as necrotizing enterocolitis. These are a number of diseases that this child will be faced with potentially in the neonatal environment. And this is exactly what we want to do in our domain, is aid the pharmaceutical industry in developing new therapies for this space. So I won't bore you with more of that sort of thing. So what I do want to do is I want to do a kind of a look back and a look forward. I want to see where we have been and then where are we going with drug development in pediatrics as a whole. And as many of you know, the pediatric domain spans the neonatal space now, which is that 23, 24, 25, all the way up to 32 weeks gestation. And then beyond that, we're looking at various age group categorizations from a regulatory authority perspective. So building a regulatory story, the FDA and the EMA both now are working simultaneously and hand in hand. I won't say in complete hand-in-hand harmony, but they're working in some harmony to develop a regulatory path and a regulatory story for pediatric drug development. We've now began to define, as of 1997 here in the United States, with the beginning of BPCA, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, and then ultimately the Pediatric Research Equity Act, and now FDASIA, which we'll talk about extensively in a few minutes. We've defined the patient populations from an age perspective, a weight perspective, sex, ethnicity, and so forth and so on. And we're beginning to look at this more carefully. And there's a number of initiatives that are out there, specifically in the neonatal space, one called the International Neonatal Consortia, which is sanctioned by the FDA and the EMA to look at and defining disease states such as bronchopulmonary dysplasia or retinopathy of prematurity or other types of diseases that we might see in the neonatal patient population. Seizures is a big issue in this population, which is a little shocking to me, and I'll share this with you, that the standard therapy for seizure control in the neonatal environment today is the same as it was in 1952, which is basically phenobarbital. Phenobarbital was invented in 1952 or discovered, and it's still the hallmark drug for anti-seizure work in the neonatal space. This has to change, and it will change, I can assure you, because we're working on some new therapies in this space. And the other thing is we decided if we need formulation development. This formulation development is broken down into palatability, and that palatability issue has broken the pharmaceutical companies into a space that's going to be costly to develop new therapies and new formulations for this population. Other places that we've been is developing internal pediatric expertise to handle the mandate for pediatric studies. This is including both pharma, academia. They have developed new skill sets and personnel to do this. When I started in this space in the late 90s, in terms of being formally introduced into the CRO space or into the pharmaceutical industry, there were very, very few people in the late 90s who actually had any expertise within the pharmaceutical industry in pediatrics. Now, there are a number of companies, Novartis, BMS, Pfizer, J&J, Shire, all of these companies, and I would highlight Novartis being at the top of that list, have developed these core internal working groups that are dedicated to aiding their company in getting the pediatric programs designed correctly and through the regulatory hurdles. The other things that we have been looking at is creating internal regulatory expertise in pediatrics within the EMA and the FDA. And the FDA has now mandated after FDASIA that neonatology be a part of their programs. And so they've appointed a neonatologist by way of the Congress of the United States, mandated this, that a neonatologist would be part of the FDA's core group, working group for looking at and evaluating drug development programs. And we'll talk about a little bit about that later. The FDA and EMA have monthly telecoms to discuss the pediatric programs. I think this is important for you in the pharmaceutical industry simply because in the past it was Europe against the United States or US against Europe. And now, because of some work that was done while I was at Duke University with many other of my colleagues there, we produced a summit, and at the end of that summit, the outcome was that the FDA and EMA would have these monthly telecoms to discuss the PIPs and the PSPs. So there's some sort of harmony with the drug development space that you will see going forward. So where are we going? We're increasing pediatric requirements for FDA and EMA. You're going to see more and more of this going forward, and I'm going to share some of those comments in a minute because we're working on a number of projects that both from the regulatory perspective at developing the PSPs and the PIPs. Age categories for studies will be moving down. Obviously, there'll be a mandate, and there is a mandate from FDASIA and the PEDCO with the EMA to take all drug development down to the neonatal space, if at all possible. And then orphan drug designation will drive the birth of new pharmaceutical companies within companies. And what you're seeing in the United States now is the pediatric voucher program for rare diseases. That's spawning a whole new enthusiasm about doing pediatric drug development. So where are we going? New pharmaceutical company expertise will emerge, orphan diseases, pediatric pharmacometrics. These are all going to be subcategories of places that we will look at. Prior to this call, we were talking a little bit about a disease state called angioma, and we're going to see companies going after that disease, even though there are only 100 cases of that in the United States every year. The average onset of that disease is 2.5 years of age in a child, and that results in a serious downstream effect. Mostly the treatment currently now is craniotomy to relieve the bleeding in the brain. There will be drugs that will be introduced probably in the next year or two that will abate that, and so we'll see more and more people looking at these orphan drug diseases. Dedicated pediatric research organizations will emerge to handle the volume of pediatric trials. Currently, the CRO model that's out there is a very poor one because pediatrics is kind of like a redheaded stepchild. We don't want to do it. We absolutely want to defer everything. We'd love to get a waiver for every project that's out there, but I'll tell you that that's not going to happen, and you're going to see a great number of these organizations pop up. Our company happens to be the first at the current moment, but there will be more. Site networks will be formed to execute new paradigms in recruiting globally. We're going to talk a little bit about that today too, about what the sites should look like and how they should perform, and then how this new paradigm will ultimately emerge for the benefit of the pharma companies, but ultimately for the benefit of the patient population. So let's look at the latest and greatest in the guidance from the FDA for the industry. This guidance document was published in July of 2013. It was made permanent in 2014. And so we're only 3 years out from having this sort of FDASIA legislation. And so what does FDASIA mean? So it really helped us craft out the pediatric study plans, who must submit an initial PSP. And when I say initial, that's important because you have what's called an agreed upon initial PSP. That is vitally important to your adult development, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So when is an initial PSP must be submitted? What should be included in the initial PSP? This is all included in the FDASIA legislation from 2012 that was signed into law by President Obama. So what should be included in the request amends to any agreed upon initial PSP, and then a template that should be used for this initial PSP will be is given to you. So what I've done is I've taken the FDASIA legislation, there's a number of pages to this guidance document, and boiled it down to what I think are the most important and key factors that you have here. One of which is that FDASIA makes permanent, no more evolving or revolving every 5-year reauthorization of the law, but which could have resulted in a repealment of the pediatric PREA and BPCA. But this new FDASIA legislation made permanent the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act and the Pediatric Research Act. The Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act was kind of the carrot. You can get your 6 months exclusivity associated with that, and you should file for that. Everybody should be filing for their 6 months exclusivity under a written request. But in addition to that, there's a Pediatric Research Equity Act component now engaged permanently, and that is the stick. So basically, carrot stick. The stick meaning that you will do it. You will get a letter from the FDA, and they're going to ask you where your pediatric program is and where your plans are, and we'll talk about that timing in just a few moments. This law also provided details of the pediatric specific formulation development. That's been a problem in the past, specifically with drugs like the antihypertensives, where long ago we figured out that we can't just do age-based dosing. We have to do weight-based dosing. And so ultimately, we went to a mg per kg dosing on everything, because many of the antihypertensives that were studied early on, all of them basically showed no efficacy because they were used in a age-based dosing. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you'd like. It ties the submission of the initial pediatric study plan to the sponsor's end. So at the end of phase 2 meeting, you have 60 days after the end of phase 2, the EOP2 meeting, to submit your initial pediatric study plan for an agreement with the FDA. That's an important date. If you are out of compliance with that, and I'm going to share with you something that I've just been recently involved in that says, what can occur at the end if you don't submit your PSP. Currently, there's what I call the no-fly list. It's a non-compliance list. It's on the FDA website, and there are a number of pharma companies on that list currently. I won't go through them and name them, but it's more of a name and shame approach as opposed to the European legislation, which is much more punitive than the U.S. legislation. The FDASIA also requires the FDA Office of Pediatric Therapeutics to have a neonatologist. I mentioned that. That neonatologist actually is a professor emeritus from Stanford University. Ron's a nice guy, super nice guy, actually. I know him well, and he's doing a good job at the agency at the current moment. So a sponsor must submit the initial PSP no later than 60 days. I already mentioned that. And it should be noted that requests for waivers in the PSP will not be formally granted or denied upon the application approval. So waivers are hard to come by. Deferrals are easier to come by. So for instance, if you're studying a pediatric compound in everything from neonates to less than 18 years of age, the agency is going to ask you to study 12 to less than 17 first to get some safety profile information, and then they'll let you march down from 6 to 11, and then from below 6 it'll go 2 to 6, and then below 2 it's going to be a whole nother game plan that you have to march to. But this is the summary plan for non-clinical and clinical studies. This is the template, and in that template you'll devise your pediatric study plan what's called the initial pediatric study plan. You will take it to the FDA. The FDA will then have to give you some feedback on that, and you'll get your guidance associated with it. And if they like what you've got here, then great. Otherwise, you'll be changing this many, many times. If you notice, you can also ask for deferrals here. Some companies really want to go with a deferral of 14 years, which is kind of ludicrous in a way. The agency was never going to let you get away with that, so you'll be stuck with whatever you've got. This is kind of a regulatory path forward if you want to look at this for both the U.S. and for Europe. In the U.S., you have at the end of EOP2, you should file your initial pediatric study plan. However, in Europe, at the end of your phase 1 meeting, your adult PK work, you have to file your PIP. And this is an agreed upon pediatric investigational plan. And then you have to, this whole process of this PIP and any modifications here leading to an approved PIP is required for your MAA submission, your market authorization of your adult indication. That's a big deal in Europe because the Europeans watched us for 10 years muck around with the legislation on pediatrics. And so the European Parliament, when I was working with the European Congress on this, they actually said, well, we're not going to let the pharmaceutical company get away with anything, so we're going to tie it to their market authorization of the adult indication. However, at this point in time, since 2007, there's not been a huge penalty associated with companies getting there, but there's been a lot of scare tactics. Another thing that the Europeans can do to you, and this is in their legislation, is they can fine you 5% of all sales of all drugs that you sell and market in Europe if you don't get an approved, agreed upon PIP. So that's a big, big issue as you begin to march through your regulatory space. This is some of the latest language that's coming out of the FDA, and this is a drug for a bowel prep that we were working on in pediatrics. And I want you to focus in on the last thing. They're looking for an agreed upon pediatric study plan, but it says failure to, and this is the language that came right out of the letter from the FDA, it says failure to include an agreed IPSP in a marketing application subject to PREA may be grounds for refusal to file action. This is a new twist from the FDA, and it's a little more threatening than just, I'm going to put you on the non-compliance list. So I'm going to kind of refuse to file your product going forward. So now I'd like to switch over to pharmacometrics for a second, because I know a number of you on the call today are pharmacometricians. That's not magicians, but metricians. And so what's happening now in the legislation is that the FDA has set a target to design all your pediatric programs, 50% of all the pediatric trials by 2015. Of course, we've already passed that date. And 100% of all pediatric trials by 2020 will have to have modeling and simulation associated with them. Now, I'll also stop here and say that the EMA has, through PEDCO, has mandated this as well. And on the last question on your initial filing for your PIP is, did you use modeling and simulation to get your dose and dosing interval? And the answer is, well, you don't know. You could say, yes, I did, and I'm doing it, or whatever, and then you have to validate that through a variety of techniques, whether it's PBPK or whether it's SimSip or some other tool that you use to model and simulate to get to the right dose and dosing interval. And that's what everyone's looking for. So our expertise in PK/PD analysis and reporting and modeling simulation, we work with Satara, as JF has already said, in our pediatric programs going forward. So European framework, the EMA is not an FDA for Europe. They are basically the operational arm for the European Commission, which was under the European Parliament, was mandated to do this work. And so the pediatric member states have pooled their sovereign authority, all 28 member states now, with the exception of the UK, the UK, this is a real mess in Brexit, but bottom line is that they pulled all their sovereignty to authorize the development of medicines for children across all these spaces. So we're seeing that now. And so the EMA coordinates the existing scientific resources of the member states. And so what that really means is that every country has the right to submit an individual, and that individual could be a scientist, a physiologist, or whomever, to sit on the PEDCO, who will evaluate your drug within that division, and then they will come back to you with questions, concerns, and redirect you towards a successful path, potentially. What I want to point out here, and this is no offense to the EMA or to the PEDCO members, but the ones that I've been interacting with, most of them are not clinicians. They are, at best, PhD scientists who may or may not have ever seen a child before. And so this presents itself as a problem, because then there will be many delays, many hours you will spend searching for the right answer that may not be answerable based upon the depth of knowledge of this particular PEDCO division head. So that's a big problem. Now, the objective of the European regulation is very straightforward. It's to improve the health of children globally. And to achieve this, they want to do it without using or unnecessarily studying a ton of kids. Well, that's all great. We have studies from about 6 countries in Europe currently going on, and we have a number of studies here in the United States going on as well. But the patient populations, for the most part, are here in the U.S. The Europeans don't have a ton of kids. Technically, across the globe, the patient population, or the pediatric numbers, is about 21% of the total populace are pediatric patients, and not all of them are sick or ill or have your disease state that you may be studying. And the other achievable goal for the EMA, and certainly the PEDCO, was they didn't want to delay the authorization of the adult drug. However, they have the authority to do that if you so choose not to follow your initial agreed upon PIP, or Pediatric Investigational Plan. This is the timeline slide for your PIP procedures. You guys will have these slides available to you afterwards. This slide was developed by Ernest Kopecky. Ernest is a good friend who's been with a number of pain management groups, and we've been on a number of speaking platforms together. But long story short, you can kind of get a sense for the longevity of the process, which is much more in depth than the PSP. So what I tell my sponsors, and this is really interesting, is that only about 11% of all of the PIPs and the PSPs are filed simultaneously. And if you really wanted to do the work correctly, you would do your PIP first and then do your PSP. And so I would initiate a PIP, and along with that, in parallel, initiate a PSP. And the reason I would do that is simply because you can get two bangs for your buck. You can take the core competency out of the technical pieces of your PIP, marry them into the PSP program, and then you can cut your cost and timeline delays for what you're doing. So that's kind of a strategy we've been looking at lately, and it works pretty nicely. The pre-PIP teleconference, I would caution you here in this space and say that whenever you talk to the PEDCO, you best have all of your ducks in a row, and it would be nice to have as much knowledge in your back pocket as possible. You can have your list of questions that you want to discuss, of course, but when you go to that initial PEDCO meeting, if you go down one rabbit hole, you're going to end up in that rabbit hole, because they're going to hold you to whatever you say at this pre-meeting. Not always, but depending upon which division you're in, you could open up Pandora's box from a timeline and a patient population study specific program. The content, you can read these slides. They want the overview of the disease, the biological product, overview of plan extrapolation to a specific pediatric population, requests for drug-specific waivers. I will tell you that there's been very few waivers granted in either the European space or in the United States. And everybody thinks that they don't have to do pediatric drug development. Prior to getting on this call, JF and I were talking about a new antidote for all the factor 10A and 2A inhibitors. And the sponsor we were working with at the time basically was in denial and said, I know I don't have to do pediatric drug development. And we said, no, you do. And so we went to the FDA meeting with that sponsor. The sponsor asked the very last question, do I have to do a pediatric program? And the answer was, here's the website, go look it up. And so basically, yes, you do have to do a pediatric development plan. And when they looked at this, they were a little bit shocked as to the detail that needed to be there. And then, of course, you've got to put your pediatric formulation development in. So all of these things that you see here before you, timelines, planned pediatric clinical studies, requests for deferrals, and so forth, you need to put into your application. So what are the challenges? Back up. What are the challenges to, and this is the practical approach part, and I'll be brief because I don't want to run out of time. I want to leave time for Q&A. But there are a number of practical approaches to doing pediatric work. And this is the heart of what I think is really missing in a lot of our pediatric project plans, specifically when you're designing a protocol and you want to get your primary, your secondary endpoints, your inclusion, exclusion criteria, and your time and events component in there, and the rest of it was kind of fluff after that. But when you've done this work for so many years, you realize that you can't take an adult protocol and just retool it for a pediatric program, and I see that almost every day. So the patient population has to be well defined. These are the challenges to implementing any pediatric plan. The protocol design, the randomization, placebo control, pharmacokinetics, dynamic measurements, blood sampling, all of these things. And we're going to talk a little bit about blood sampling in a moment, because this is a big issue, especially when you get down to the younger age groups. We're currently doing a study now where we're collecting blood through a heel stick, and we need 0.6 ml of whole blood to get 300 microliters of serum to look at cytokine levels in this one particular patient population. And it's doable, it's tremendously doable, but you can only stick this kid one time. You will not be able to stick them more than once for this particular study. So, and then we need to look at long-term outcomes. This is another big issue, because even if you're developing an antihypertensive drug, the FDA, and we were involved in this a number of years ago when I was at Duke University, the FDA came back to us, or came back to the sponsor and said, we want you to do cognitive function testing on these kids for at least the next 24 months. And it was an antihypertensive drug. Well, that throws everybody into a tailspin, because what cognitive function tests do you do? And how long is attention span for a child? I can tell you that if you've got a child who's 6 to 12 or 12 to 18, their attention span is about a nanosecond. They're not going to sit still for you to do a computerized cognitive function test that's going to last 3 hours. It has to be something that's very doable and doable in a short period of time, possibly 15, 20, 30 minutes at the max. The investigator pool is another challenge. Our investigator pool is growing both here in the United States and around the globe, but I can tell you that depending upon your disease state and what you're looking for, it's very, very challenging. We just finished a feasibility last year for chronic pain, and we surveyed over 800 chronic pain or potential chronic pain centers in North America. And out of the 800, there were only 21 centers that could actually do the study. That's an abysmal failure waiting to happen. So you have to be aware of what's out there on the domain, and if you don't, you'll be in a big mess when it comes down to operationalizing your protocol. So you need to be cognizant of what you put in that inclusion exclusion criteria and what you've negotiated out with the FDA or EMA. Training of global teams, this is going to be important, because you've got to have everybody at equipoise. You cannot have one group doing one thing and another group doing another, or you can't be doing rescue work when it's a failure in Europe and you try to come to the United States for the success. The lack of global pediatric drug development expertise in the industry and regulatory area is another big issue that we deal with almost every day. And then certainly the ethical issues, assent and consent, location of the trial. Is it a global trial? Is it a seasonal trial? Is it an RSV trial, respiratory syncytial virus, where you have two hemispheres you have to work with? And that's a big, big problem. Those trials take on massive headcount when you do that. And then certainly the number of trials, the competing trials in a similar space. So if you're thinking you've got to go into neonatology, and to tell you that there are 4.2 million children born in the United States every year, and of that 4.2 million, only 10% of them, or 420,000 of those babies, are preterm babies. And of those 420,000, there's probably 20 to 30 studies going on at any given time in that space in the US and in the European space. You have to look at that carefully. And then you start playing that out and you say, well, there are 847 neonatal intensive care units who can actually do this work in the US. And of those 847, how many of them have competing programs? That's a big, big problem. So you need to know clearly the domain. And then certainly the regulatory hurdles, both the FDA and the EMA, and certainly cost. And we're going to talk a little bit about cost. What it costs to do these clinical trials. Global challenges, equivalency of medical treatment. So the medical treatment in Europe is not the same as it is in the US necessarily. Just to give you an example, the size of the neonatal intensive care units in Europe is average about 14 cots or beds. In the United States, the average neonatal intensive care unit is about 60 beds. So where would you do your trial? You'd do it in the US. And you might supplement it with some of the European network for neonatal work. Concomitant medications are always a big issue. SAE reporting. This is getting to a lot of attention, especially in the younger age groups, because if you've got more critical the child is in a neonatal intensive care unit or pediatric intensive care unit, the higher the number of SAEs. And so therefore, or AEs for that matter, that's the workload, that's the expense it's going to cost the pharmaceutical industry in doing this type of work. We have ways now to par these AEs and SAE reporting down, and it's been validated and affirmed by the FDA and the EMA. Patient age group differs country by country, and then preclinical requirements, local representation, and quality of lab work. So these are some of the, get rid of that. So these are some of the other things like patient insurance liability, container labels, certificates of analyses, and so forth. These are all challenges that we see. So let's get into something else. This is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, is that when you develop a drug, and this is the formulation piece, that I don't know how many of you on the audience have children, but I had a gentleman in my office yesterday who was giving his child an antibiotic, and he said, well, he gave it to him the first time, it's all good. The second time, it took two people to hold the kid down to get the antibiotic in them. So there's a rule in pharmacology, and the rule is that if you don't get the drug to the site of activity, it won't work. Well, if you don't get the drug in the child, it won't work either. And so therefore, how much is 1 teaspoon minus 2 coughs and a dribble? Well, you don't get the drug, you don't get your data, and so data integrity is killed when you try to give drugs that are not formulated appropriately for that age group. The ideal characteristics of orally administered medicines, you can read these. I won't go through that because we're going to run out of time. But you know, you just basically want to improve the patient compliance, decrease the onset time and modify absorption, and increase the bioavailability of your product. Poor taste, spit ups, these are all administration issues. Putting drugs in NG tubes in infants is a big problem, because the drug typically will adhere to the sidewall of the NG tube that you're using, whether it's polyvinyl chloride or some other type of NG tube, and it sticks to the side and you don't get the drug to the site. Even if you try to back flush it, you still won't get the drug in the patient at the prescribed dose that you think you are. And we're actually doing a study now, which is really kind of a cool thing. I'll mention this to you. It's the first ever dose escalation phase 1 neonatal open heart study looking at a new antiplatelet drug ever done. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And one of the problems is that the drug hides in the dead space of the tubing. And if you're doing PK analyses, you've got to be able to get the exact amount of the drug in the child so you can know what the exact dose should be. So we're doing this dose escalation phase 1 study to determine the dose and then ultimately the dosing interval. And you can't do that if you have dead space of drug hanging out in your plastic tubing. And I could tell you story after story about tablets and capsules and crushing and developing formulations. What I will say here is that if you think you've got an adult drug and you're going to over-encapsulate it to give it to a child, I will tell you that a 6, a 7, or 8-year-old cannot swallow a tablet very well, and so consequently they can't swallow a capsule very well. And so if you've been mandated to do 6 to 12, 12 to 18 age group by the regulators, then you need to reformulate your drug, and that's you're going to be told at the regulatory agency. So let's talk a little bit about palatability. Palatability is not what you think it is. It's not taste only. It's taste, smell, feel, how the drug feels in the mouth of the patient, and it also has to do with how well we can orchestrate giving this drug to this patient population. So palatability is a complicated factor. The only palatability scale that's ever been developed was developed at Hospital for Sick Kids by Friedman back in 2010. And it's more of a visual analog scale, if you will, to almost like pain, except this is a palatability scale that's out there and has been validated. Let's talk about blood sampling for a minute. What we want to do is maximize the information we get, basically get the data integrity where we want it from a PK perspective so we can get dose and dosing interval with the minimum number of samples. Recently, I was involved in a study, and the pharmacologist for this company basically had outlined in the protocol that, and this was a neonatal study, that they wanted to obtain 14 PK samples in the first 24 hours of life. And I don't know what planet they were on, but they obviously haven't seen a neonatal patient before. So blood volume is a big problem, and certainly sticking a child is a big problem. So protocol development consideration should take into consideration the age group of which you're looking at and limit the number of PK samples. So in a situation where you've got a drug that's got a half-life of 36 hours, you really don't need 14 samples in that 36 hours period of time. You may need 3 or 4. I would err for the lowest number you can possibly get, and that's where we get into the modeling and simulation world. So these are some of the blood volumes that you need to be considered here. A neonatal patient, a preterm baby, has about 90 mils of blood per kilo, newborns about 80, and so forth and so on. I won't bore you with this sort of thing, but I will say that that's kind of the basis for what you're dealing with. You can't exsanguinate these patients when you get the blood out of them, because they also have to have normal labs being drawn at the same time. So the NIH Guidelines says that 3 mils per kilo can be drawn for research purposes, and no more than 7 mils per kilo can be drawn over a 6-week period of time. This becomes an IRB issue as you march into the approval of your program going into the clinic. And then the experimental from the American Academy of Pediatrics, I say 1 to 2 mils per kilo per month is a standard, or about 3% of body weight. This is what a naive pharma company would look at and say. They would say, well, we're going to get a CBC and a chem on this patient population, maybe it's a platelet ag test. We're going to get PK samples and more PK samples and so forth. And these are all in the first 24 hours of life. And so we'll collect 9.75 mils per kilo. Wrong answer. Can't do that. This is something that would be a nice model to use for a protocol as a good starting point for blood sampling. And I'll just leave this with you. I'm not going to bore you with this. The other thing is about where do you collect your samples. Are you going to do a straight stick on the kid using an IV access? Are you going to do heel sticks? Are you going to do venous sampling? How are you going to do this, and what are you going to do? Many times we use a product called Emla Cream if we're going to stick these babies. That's eutectic mixture of local anesthetics. This is prilocaine and lidocaine mixture at 2.5% each. And so what you get is a nice child who doesn't feel the pain of a stick. You just ask them to turn their head, and you can stick them, and they'll never know that they were stuck. But it takes about 45 minutes to onset this drug, so you can get your sampling, and you have to coordinate that with the clinic and where you're going to get the blood from. And also, you want to use the smallest gauge needle possible. 23 gauge is a great one to use because you just don't feel it going in, or at least you don't feel it as much. Avoid intrusive sampling such as CSF and biopsies. Bronchial washings, that's a difficult place to be. I have done some work in pH probe work in neonates before, and that was fairly challenging. We did it in Australia, France, US, and Germany. Very, very challenging trial. But now we can look at things like saliva and stool sampling and urine sampling and get data from that, so we can model it to give our data, give us data integrity for modeling and simulation for dose and dosing intervals. These are some of the analytical tests that over my career have been developed for more of the pediatric space. In 1998, when I got really into looking at global pediatric drug development after the 1997 BPCA regulation was engaged, what we had was a very poor central lab world that looked at anything in pediatrics. And so now we have microvolume drug assay techniques such as GC mass spec, mass spec. We also try to eliminate triplicates. We may do duplicates. It depends on what we have available to us. The story about the heel stick and the cytokines that I gave you earlier, we only are getting 0.6 mLs or 300 microliters. We need exactly 300 microliters to do a one assay shot at getting the cytokines in these kids. Otherwise, we just can't do the study. And then the thing that's evolving now is microfluidics. Microfluidics is going to be kind of the wave of the future. It's not quite totally baked yet, but it's coming. There are a number of people in Northern Ireland who've got a great handle on how to do microfluidic analytical assays. They can do siRNA, RNA, iRNA. You can name anything you want, and they pretty much can develop this. But right now, we're doing this antiplatelet study I mentioned earlier, and they're using microfluidics to look at their clotting factors. That's a great idea, but it needs a lot more thought put into it as from what I'm seeing. And then dry blood spot technology. This has been tried by a number of pharma companies to get drugs developed using DBS, but it's not totally validated either, and it's still a work in progress, I'll say. Site selection. We're going to go through this very briefly. There are three types of sites that we deal with. These are all basically in the bucket of challenges. If you don't go to the right place, you will get crappy data. So if you go to the academic experts, great place to go. Long startup period, costly environment, and they may not enroll. I like to use what I call the second tier training centers. These are really, really good places to go. We have a number of these that we work with strategically here in the United States and other parts of the world, but the academic places give us more of the KOL space who are costly and don't enroll, but we do use their expertise and some of their data from their databases to do this. And then lastly, this just general clinics. We don't do a lot of general clinic work out there in clinical research, but there are some things that we do. The thing that will be coming forward to you in a very short period of time is something called the Sustainable Site Networks. What we're going to see first is the Neonatal Site Sustainable Network. And this Sustainable Site Network will guarantee 20 centers that will enroll patients, specifically in the neonatal space. We are developing that on our own here. There'll be others that are working on this as well. But I'll tell you that talk is cheap. We need to get on with it. It costs money to do this. So speaking of costing money, what's the exclusivity cost? We published this paper in JAMA in 2007 from Duke, Jennifer Lee, and a number of other individuals who are on this. Was thinking that the U.S. was getting taken to the cleaners on the cost analysis, but it turns out that the exclusivity cost for doing these types of trials was about $12.5 million, and the return on investment, unless you had a blockbuster drug, was not very well at all. As a matter of fact, you break even or even lose money on pediatric drug development. So what have we learned? We've learned from every pediatric trial that we've ever done, and I can give you story after story about that. Pediatric drug development is complex and difficult. Even in the era of common diseases with multiple clinical trials, there remains many questions to be answered. And are we treating a different disease within the same trial? The rigors in design and execution is essential, but reasonable goals. And we must, it must be done in partnership with the industry, the regulators, academic pediatricians, patient and family groups. And we're starting to see the patient-family group category now, especially in Europe, being mandated into the protocol design and development. And this is very, very vital, and I welcome this. I think it's a great idea. We must learn from our failures and also recognize that we learn, as we learn, pediatric clinical trials will provide more valuable and scientific, valid results. So from the future, the way forward, globalization of pediatric research is real, and it's here. The volume of pediatric trials is only going to escalate, and I can tell you now it's in the thousands, but it's going to go even more. The EU has passed their legislation in 2006, and in 2007, it was authorized into operations by the EMA, and the EU passed exclusivity tied to study performance, like we have here in the United States, where you get a 6-month patent extension. And then the European Union mandated requirements for this pediatric investigational plan to get your market authorization for your adult indication. A whole new twist on the regulatory framework, especially as it applies to your adult. So you will do the pediatric work as you go forward. And the FDA passed the PEDIATRICS in 2012, which now has allowed us a permanent fix for performing pediatric clinical trials going forward, both in Europe and in the United States. So with that, I think I'm done. And with this last slide, this child now is about 27 years old. She was the 28-week, 750-gram child in the front slide. And what I usually say is that if we don't stand up for children, then we don't stand for much in this world, because this is the future of our world, not just our country or any country. It's the future of our world. And so I think that doing drug development in this space is exciting, it's life-changing, and I welcome all of you and all your questions that you might have after this presentation. So thank you very much for hearing and listening to my stories and anecdotes. I'll stop here and turn it back over to Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Barry. Looks like we've got a bunch of questions from our audience. First question is, what are your thoughts on the consistency of clinical protocols in rare disease pediatric patients across multiple geographic regions?
Protocols. I think that when you're designing your program, you need to think about a global environment. And what we typically do is we pull together ad boards from both sides of the pond. We did this recently in a rare disease. The disease was hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. And so we pulled together 3 members in Europe who were thought leaders, who were really good people, who obviously I knew. And then there were 3 people in the US that we pulled together to form an ad board to design the trial that would become the phase 2 trial for the pediatric program. That model works really well, and you get buy-in from, we'll just say, key opinion leaders on both sides of the pond. And they don't have to be academicians necessarily. I like to mix in people who have practical knowledge of doing research, who are clinicians, but they have done research. So if you haven't done it, you probably shouldn't design it. And so that's just my thoughts.
Okay, it looks like we have one final question from our audience. We do capture all questions, and we can answer them by email after the presentation. Do you foresee any changes to the drug exclusivity as part of the pediatric program?
No, I think that you're going to continue to get your 6-month exclusivity if you ask for it. What's really interesting is that I deal with a number of pharma companies, and they don't even know about the exclusivity, and therefore they don't apply for the written request. And so when you're doing you're responding to your PRIA request, or you're doing your initial pediatric study plan in the United States or in Europe, you need to ask for that exclusivity. It's a really simple thing to do. While you're filling out all the paperwork, you might as well do that and then tag on to the back end 6 months of market exclusivity. It has a different terminology in Europe, but it's basically the same function.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Before concluding the webinar, we have a few announcements. The next webinar in the series will take place on September 14th. Steve Sibley will present Agreeing to Submission Document Timelines and Sticking to Them, Fairy Tale or Reality. On September 27th, Doctors Angela Colbers and Rick Grupink of the Radboud University Medical Center will present Using PBPK Models to Optimize Anti-HIV Drug Dosing for Pregnant Women. On October 4th, Doctors Craig Rayner from Certara and Carl Kirkpatrick from Monash University will present Pharmacology to Payer, one quantitative drug development framework to rule them all. Finally, on October 31st, Professor J.M. Cardo from Auvergne University will present How to Perform Level C IVIVC in Phoenix. You can register for all webinars in this series by visiting certara.com/webinars. Now I'll hand it over to Vicki to conclude the webinar.
Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with the recorded archive for this event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen shortly, and your participation is greatly appreciated as it will help us to improve our future webinars. Now please join us in thanking our speakers, Dr. J.F. Marier and Dr. Barry Mangum, and you can do so by clicking the link in the chat box. We hope you have found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.